الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين وأفضل الصلاة وأتم التسليم على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وأصحابه أجمعين. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. We will begin from page number 72 on the Arabic, and the section is entitled As-Su'alu fil Barzakhi, questions in Barzakh. The Shaykh says جاء في الآيات القرآنية والأحاديث النبوية ما يدل قطعا على أن سؤال القبر هو حق وهو يتناول المسلم والكافر والمنافق. وقال الحافظ في الفتح واختلف في الطفل غير المميز. Now there's a debate, early theological debate about the grave and Barzakh itself. Is Barzakh itself a place where people will be asked questions? We know that Allah uses the word Barzakh in the Quran, but if we unpack that, what does that mean, or what that means is differed upon. The orthodox position, the Sunni position, has always been pretty much that the idea of Adhab al-Qabr and Na'im al-Qabr, meaning the questions of the grave, the kind of the bliss of the grave and the punishment of the grave, is something that's true and something that will happen. Other groups had some difference with that, like the Mu'tazila, who are not traditional orthodox groups. What would be considered how we define Sunni Muslims. And so there has been, so the Shaykh makes a kind of hyperbolizes that point. He says, Ja'a fil ayat al-Qur'aniyya, that we have in the Quran. The question is, why would they differ over something that we all accept anyway as Ahlul Sunnah? They would differ because their argument is that there's no clear verse in the Quran for it. The reply to that is there are verses that are inferential, that infer, but there are quite a few ahadith, and for those ahadith they reject those ahadith, but those ahadith in our tradition are sound, and they're authentic ahadith. So he states that we have ayat of Quran and ahadith of the Prophet that decisively denote or point to the questioning of the grave. And that includes a Muslim, a kafir, and a sinful Muslim. Or meaning Muslim and a kafir, and the Muslim can be divided into two: somebody who's obeyed God and somebody who is not in God's favor. For Jazm al-Qurtubi, he mentioned, but he does say right at the end that there is some difference of opinion on one category of people amongst Sunni scholars, and that is, what about children, young children, before the age of tamyiz, which is like before the age of 8, maybe 7 or 8, are they questioned in the grave? One couldn't even argue before puberty, before maturity. So there's some difference on that. And this is فجزم القرطبي في التذكير بأنه يسأل منقول عن أبي حنيفة وجزم غير واحد من الشافعي بأنه لا يسأل. It's neither here nor there. These are just opinions of scholars now. In the sense that Imam Qurtubi, the great Mufassir, he writes that yes, young children will be questioned in the grave. And he relates this from Abu Hanifa, and then Shafi'i relates the opposite, or the opposite is related from Shafi'i, but this is neither here nor there. There's no dalil for it. I mean, these are just extrapolations and ijtihadat. The rational, I think, position would be that they're not, because they're not mukallaf anyway. The question is, will they be asked who their prophet is and who their Lord is? But the issue with that would be, if it's for ma'rifatul khabar, that's different. If they just want to know from them, that's one. But if it's for testing them, that doesn't make that much sense, because children at the age of 6, 7, and 8, don't really necessarily understand those things very well. And the ghayr mukallaf anyway, there's no obligation upon them at that point to testify on these types of things. Only when the Sharia is not, they're not obliged with the Sharia. At that point, even about Iman, they don't know the kind of the generality of beliefs related to God, etc., except by a lip service, where they can repeat them, but do they really understand anything? فيسأل الميت عن اعتقاد بالله تعالى ورسوله صلى الله عليه وسلم على وجه الاختبار والامتحان. The believer will be asked about or not just a believer, but any person who passes will be asked about Allah and His Messenger as an examination, ala wajh al-ikhtibar wal-imtihan, and not like a conversation, but rather they actually pushing you to give an answer because they're testing you. So the difference between talking to somebody and having a conversation with them and actually testing somebody. So conditions are when anybody's tested, the conditions are clearly more, a person's more anxious, more nervous. The atmosphere is different. So if you can imagine yourself in an examination scenario, situation, atmosphere, that's what the Shaykh says it will be like. And there'll be fahas and tamhis, meaning that it's like an investigation. You'll be examined. Now he mentions a very important ayah that all of the ulama generally mention on this at this point, where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, يُثَبِّتُ اللَّهُ الَّذِينَ آمَنُوا بِالْقَوْلِ ثَابِتِ فِي الْحَيَاةِ الدُّنْيَا وَفِي الْآخِرَةِ وَيُضِلُّ اللَّهُ الظَّالِمِينَ وَيَفْعَلُ اللَّهُ مَا يَشَاءُ. That Allah Jalla wa Ala يُثَبِّتُ اللَّهُ الَّذِينَ آمَنُوا بِالْقَوْلِ ثَابِتِ. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala يُثَبِّتُ gives strength to those who believe, بالقول الثابت, with a word of affirmation, with a word of, or rather with verbal affirmation, meaning those Allah says in the world and in the hereafter are made given tathbeet by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that they're given strength by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in their word, i.e. what they say is firm, it's true, and it's in accordance to true belief, you could say, in this world and the here. في الدنيا وفي الآخرة ويضل الله الظالمين. God misguides the oppressors. ويفعل الله ما يشاء. God does as He pleases. Many of the scholars they extrapolate from this the idea that في الآخرة قول الثابت في الآخرة includes the barzakh, includes the grave. So Allah gives them a firm statement. Allah gives them a statement in this world, those who stand up and say, tell the truth. The Shaykh says, فَهُ سُبْحَانَهُ وَتَعَالَى يُثَبِّتُ الَّذِينَ آمَنُوا إِيمَانًا صَادِقًا لَا نِفَاقًا. That Allah gives them strength. يُثَبِّتُ الَّذِينَ آمَنُوا إِيمَانًا صَادِقًا لَا نِفَاقًا. Gives them iman sadiq, those who believe. He strengthens them in iman, true iman. And no nifaq. Nifaq means kind of outward action without internal belief. بالقول الثابت. And what's that قول الثابت? Is لا إله إلا محمد رسول الله. That's a shahada, this statement of truth. Yeah, I accept that proposition, that children are innocent, therefore they go to heaven. So that's a position I think most scholars lean towards anyway. But maybe there was somebody that leaned towards another opinion. But that seems to be the clear point from the Quran and the narrative of the Quran. فَإِنَّ هَذَا هُوَ الْقَوْلُ الثَّابِتُ كَمَا يَدُلُّ عَلَيْهِ الْحَدِيثُ الْآتِي. That this statement that Allah is talking about, يُثَبِّتُ اللَّهُ الَّذِينَ آمَنُوا بِالْقَوْلِ الثَّابِتِ, that قول الثابت, this word of affirmation is لا إله إلا محمد رسول الله. Then he continues on the next page and he says, فَإِنَّ مِنَ الْمَعْلُومِ الْمُقَرَّرِ إِنَّ أَهْلِ الْعِلْمِ وَالْفِكْرِ أَنَّ الْأَدِلَّةَ الَّتِي ثبتت بها الأمور مهما كثرت فإنها ترجع إلى أصلين عظيمين البرهان والعيان. ولا ريب أن الله تعالى قد أشهد العباد مشاهد لا إله إلا الله محمد رسول الله في آيات الأكوان المرئية مشهودة بالعيان وفي الآيات القرآن التي جاءت بالحجة والبرهان العقلي. Now, this is an important point he mentions. I do like, actually, really interesting point. He says what we know is that Ahlul Ilm, the people of knowledge, and people of fikr, meaning people of deep insight, have divided evidences into two forms. Yeah, and they say most things return to these two forms of evidence. And these two forms of evidence are, you could say they're two epistemic pegs, you could call them. One of them is burhan, the other is ayan. One of them is burhan, which is proofs that come through rational proofs and textual proofs. But the other is ayan. The other is ayan, and ayan can be translated as that which is beyond textual and rational proof. I.e., we're talking about evidences, a form of evidence that is beyond that. And he says, for example, when we talked about the first covenant, before the genesis of the body, you could say, before we were this body, that covenant that takes place so many millions of years ago, possibly billions of years ago. That's from Ayan, and Ayan is the idea that from kind of mushahada. Now, this type of knowledge, of course, has always been argued. Its existence has always been argued, of course, by certain people or certain inclinations, and those people have been people that have taken a spiritual route to knowing that which is beyond, or knowing the divine even. For the Muslims, the people who try to develop this as a science almost, or develop this as a field, were the Sufis. And by Sufis, not the way that it's pejoratively used now by people who don't understand what the term means. And they assume that these are some crazy people in Kurdistan or Baghdad trying to take their eyeballs out, or moving their hair like mad people up and down and coming over their faces, or slapping themselves in the face to get a spiritual state, or people who are dancing to qawwali or something. No, I'm not talking about those people, of course. I'm talking about raw tasawwuf. I'm talking about the idea that knowledge can be gained or can be acquired through spiritual training, and this was always believed by all of the early Muslims, through this idea, through dhikr, the idea through isolation, through fasting, all of these things that heighten one's spiritual senses, you could say, and lead a person to spiritual openings, al-futuhat al-ilahiyah. So that's what I'm talking about, and that route has always existed, but it seems to be a very hard route, and that's why in the Quran and even in the Sunnah was for the general masses, but you have elements within the life of the Prophet that infer this form of spirituality, and it's a very, very interesting one. It's a very interesting one. So he says that that's another form of knowledge. That's another form of knowledge. In fact, the people of spirituality argue that that's the only true form of knowledge, and that true form of knowledge will coincide with what God has mentioned, and that's the factor. That's a testing factor where one may say, what if people start having these experiences, and even Buddhists have experiences, but with us there's a balance between al-haqiqah and at-tariqah, which is the idea that Sharia wal-haqiqah, sorry, which is the law was really revealed by God, and haqiqah, the reality, can never contradict that. The spiritual reality can never contradict that. And this is for هذه الآيات الأكوان من نظر فيها واعتبر في إتقان صنعه وإحكام خلقها صنعها وصنعها both are fine وإبداء وجودها رأى آثار قدرة رب العالمين وحكمته وسعة علمه. Allah says in the Quran, قُلْ انظروا ماذا في السماوات والأرض, that, O Messenger of God, tell them to reflect, to cogitate, to ponder over that which is in the celestial realms and that which is on earth. Allah says, Allahu alladhi khalaqa sab'a samawati wa min al-ardi mithlahunna yatanazzalu al-amru baynahunna lita'lamu anna Allah ala kulli shay'in qadir. Another verse where Allah again tells people that He created the seven samawat, wa min al-ardi mithlahunna, and from the earth it's like. So the Shaykh says these are kind of verses where God tells us to deeply look at. وهذه الآيات الكونية المشهودة المرئية التي أجراها الله تعالى على يد النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم والتي تسمى بالمعجزات وخوارق العادات كلها مشاهد تشهد العاقل أن محمد صلى الله عليه وسلم فهذا مشاهد العيان. So there's two parts. He says the mushahid al-ayan can simply be just looking at the earth as well, just kind of basic. It starts at a basic reflection. Whereas the second level of ayan, of course, is always to look beyond the material. And then he says everybody can come see that and come to these conclusions rationally, or come to these conclusions of, you could say, through causality. فَأَمَّا شَوَاهِدُ الْبُرْهَانِ وَأَدِلَّتُهُ. As for burhan, evidences and textual evidence, we look at the Quran, which infers decisively these things. And through mu'jizat. The mu'jizat are an interesting one, miracles. What do miracles actually mean? I know miracles are a hot topic now amongst many. That does Allah have a sunnah? Meaning, does God do things in certain ways, i.e., are what we call physics constants, sometimes referred to as laws. Are they laws of God? Do they exist? And are they fixed if they do exist? And if they do exist and they are fixed, does that mean that miracles would mean essentially a shift, a paradigm shift from the idea of sunnatullah to God then breaking that particular law that he's designated? Is that what? And so this argument has been raised that, by some, that miracles can't exist, i.e. miracles as in khariqul adat, things that go against the laws as we perceive them anyway, the constants of the world, because why would God do that? Why would he create them in the first place? So that's another debate and discussion. I will address that another time, maybe in another subject, about miracles and touching on, things about, for instance, especially in quantum mechanics, and do the laws of nature actually exist in the first place? Or is this merely man's perception of these laws? And we'll entertain in that the simulation hypothesis and all these other computational ideas now that are coming out, but not here. But we believe in mu'jizat, generally miracles. Of course we do. Wal ayatud dala. Now, the Shaykh says there are two types of strength that God gives. Amma tathbituhum fil hayati dunya, one in the dunya, one in the akhirah. In the dunya, how does God give one strength with this statement, la ilaha illallah? فهو مما يعتريهم من الوسواس والشبهات الشيطانية. That la ilaha illallah takes away, or this word or this strength is a strength that God gives people that responds to or pushes away shubuhat, doubts from the devil, and waswas, whisperings. من قبل الإنس أو الجن والجن, from human beings or from the jinn. And God protects people from deviation, wal mail ila dalal, and inclination towards misguidance. As for the akhirah, he says that divides into two as well. The first is the qabr, the grave, and the second is the day of judgment. Now he states the grave, and he begins to present his evidences now for the grave. Imam Muslim and Imam al-Bukhari in the Sahihain, in both of their collections, there's a hadith that the Messenger of God said, Al-Muslimu idha su'ila fil qabri shahida an la ilaha illallah wa anna Muhammadan Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. When a Muslim is asked in the grave, he will reply, will testify that there is no God but Allah, Muhammad is his messenger. So this is the first, because it states Al-Muslimu idha su'ila fil qabr, if he's asked, when he's asked in the grave. So in the akhirah, of course, therefore that's the first stage. And the second stage would be, will include the hisab. Now, there's another hadith that Imam al-Bukhari and Imam Muslim narrate from Anas, which is, إِنَّ الْعَبْدَ إِذَا وُضِعَ فِي قَبْرِهِ وَتَوَلَّى عَنْهُ أَصْحَابُهُ إِنَّهُ لَيَسْمَعَ قَرْعَ نِعَالِهِمْ إِذَا انصَرَفُوا أَتَاهُ مَلَكَانِ وَيُقْعِدَانِهِ فَيَقُولَانِ لَهُ مَا كُنْتَ تَقُولُ فِي هَذَا الرَّجُلِ Muhammad alayhi salatu wasalam. That when a person is placed in his grave, the Messenger of God states, he hears the remnants or the last sounds of the footsteps, the last of the people walking away from the cemetery, from his grave rather, or when they're leaving. And atahu malakani, two angels come and they sit him up. Now, interestingly, we have other hadith as well, and to make some tatbiq here, to reconcile all of the different narrations, it seems that one is given cognition again, you could say, at this point. So when people begin to leave the graveyard, that's the point that your senses return to you. What actually returns to you? Do you have all of your cognitive faculties at that point? And it seems absolutely, because cognitive faculties what are they? So even in sense perception, for instance, all these types of things. We hear, we see, and we can touch. Therefore, we can feel, because the whole point of touching is to feel. These three return to the person in the grave. Now, bear in mind that we already have experienced that these three, all of them, are not dependent on the body being alert, or not dependent on the body. We know that for a fact. How do we know that? We know that because of the realm of dreams. In dreams, we see, we hear, and we feel, yet the body has no part to play in that. Clearly has no part to play in that. As for the ghusl, I mentioned last week that my own understanding of that is that the soul is not there at that time when they're washing the body. And that particular hadith about pressing about if the dead feeling it is to do with the sacred nature of the body and how to treat the body. We can address that a bit later anyway. The soul seems to return if we make tatbiq, if we are to reconcile all of the evidences at this point, at the point of the grave. There are the evidences that allude, but the evidences for after the post-death are quite confusing. So you have liqa'ullah, you have all these confusing evidences. So it's very difficult to kind of put them together. But it seems to me anyway that the return of faculties, or one returns to, or one begins to understand and perceive as they did in the world again at that point, at the point of questioning. So they ask, in this narration, it says they ask the person, the grave, Ma kunta taqul fi hadha rajul, what did you say about this man? And the messenger of God appears in the grave. It seems quite clear. Imam Suyuti stated his opinion was that the Prophet ﷺ is seen in the grave at this point. What that sight is, Allah Ta'ala alam, nobody knows how that occurs. Had min qudratillah, however Allah wishes that to occur. But clearly it's a ru'ya. It's something that's seen. The messenger of God is seen. Now there's always been this debate amongst the some of the ulama, and especially some of the people of tasawwuf, that does the messenger of God come into the grave in the sense that if you wanted, you could communicate with him, you could touch and feel him. There's always been this debate. So Allah Ta'ala alam. Because from all the evidences, it seems that you're shown the messenger of God, but that's the extent of it. Why? Because all that hadith then continue with the questioning, etc., etc. So the messenger of God, if that would mean enters your grave, you see him, but you are not able to converse with him, because no evidence suggests that at all. But he's there, and then he leaves. So we don't know how that manifests. It's one of the things of the unseen. But it's the clearly ma kunta taqul fi hadha rajul. So Suyuti states you can only say fi hadha rajul if somebody's there. So he then testifies that that is the messenger of Allah, and then he's shown his place in two places. The first place he's shown is a place of his place in the fire, and also his place in heaven, paradise. He's shown these places as we're shown things in our dreams. Some hadith narrate that a window is opened. By window, just to clarify, it doesn't mean like your double glazed window that you open to let some air in. A window can mean like a celestial window is opened. Something above him is open and he sees, because the sight seems to be an all-encompassing sight where it's a window that's a kind of a metaphysical window that's open for him, where he can now actually see Jahannam as if he's there, and it's shown to him, and then he sees Jannah as if he's there, and Allah is shown to him to show him what he was saved from and what he's been rewarded with. The Messenger of God said, وَأَمَّا الْكَافِرُ الْمُنَافِقُ فِي رِوَاءٍ أَمَّا الْكَافِرُ وَالْمُرْتَابُ. In one narration, as for the kafir and the munafiq, and in one, or أَمَّا الْكَافِرُ وَالْمُرْتَابُ, the one who majorly commits major sin, he says, لَا أَدْرِي كُنْتُ أَقُولُ مَا يَقُولُ النَّاسِ فِيهِ. I don't know. I just used to say what people said, i.e. that he's unaware that knowledge is not there. And that's why ilm is very important. Knowledge, seeking knowledge is very. I keep kind of saying it, that at least your basic knowledge, and knowledge does have a limit to a degree, but knowledge must be explored and studied. And there are different elements of it. There's a beautiful story of the great Sheikh Al-Qutb al-Rabbani, Sheikh Abul Abbas Ahmad bin Mustafa al-Allawi al-Mustaghanimi, who died in 1934, rahimahullah ta'ala. And he was sitting one day with his disciples, and he's sitting there, and there's a cup of tea in front of him. And he begins to pour into the cup, and it starts overflowing. And then he stops. And then he said, "Do you understand that?" to his disciples. "Do you know what that is?" And they said, "No, Shaykh, we don't know. We don't get what you're trying to say here." He said, "That is knowledge of the outward. That is knowledge of Sharia and these things." He said, "This is a person." He said, "This is a student of knowledge. And there's an extent that he can study to. And after that, he can't contain anymore. There's a limit to it." Then he takes a rose petal and he puts it on the top. And he says, "Do you know what that is?" So what? I said, "What?" He said, "That's ilmul batin." He said, "That's knowledge of spirituality, of the internal." He said, knowledge of the internal only beautifies that which somebody studies from the external. And it floats on top of it. That's what his point was. Meaning you can place it on top and it will stay there. Whereas if you put more knowledge in it, there'll be no more space, room. There's only so much that you can. It's a wonderful story of him. Rahimullah ta'ala. Yeah, so then it states that then he's punished in his grave. And there are several ahadith that the Messenger of God in one said that only mankind فَيَصِيحُ صِيحَةً يَسْمَعُهَا مَنْ يَلِيهِ إِلَّا ثَقَلَيْنِ, that the jinn and mankind can't hear it, but animals can hear it, and they scream that he cries out. So let's move on now. Good for time. We'll do another short part and then we'll get to questions, inshallah. So there's this narration that فَيَقُولَانِ قَدْ كُنَّا نَعْلَمُ أَنَّكَ تَقُولُ هَذَا ثم يصفح له في قبره 70 ذراعا في 70 ذراع ثم ينور له فيه ثم يقال له Now, there's a narration that, and this for the believer, and we'll finish on this narration, then I'll take questions, inshallah. That after the believer asks positively, and there's more to this, and we're going to discuss this next week, inshallah. Once he answers positively, that sab'una dhira, by the way, in Arabic, 70 or 7 is a general number, yadullu ila al-kathra. It infers the idea of many. So they open for him 70 arm lengths, meaning a vast amount of land. So his grave, from a very small room that he was perceiving at that time, now he's seeing it as something vast. Now remember, we're not in the physical world anymore, we're in Alamul Barzakh, and like the dream world, you could call it its sister world. The laws of physics, as in our world, don't work in the same way, and things are malleable there. So this is expanded, and in one narration it states that it's made green for him. So now there's a conflict. There's a narration. There's several narrations that conflict. One of them states that the land is made green, and then he's told to sleep. So the question is, are you sent to this land, this green land, where you meet other people, or do you go to sleep? That's a really interesting question. I'm going to address that next week. Or do some people go to that land and do some people sleep? Because there's a verse in Surah Yasin which states, Man ba'athana min marqadina hadha ma wa'ada ar-Rahman wa sadaqa al-mursalun. Who has awoken us or resurrected us min marqadina, from the place that we were resting or sleeping. هَذَا مَا وَعَدَ الرَّحْمَنُ. This is what God had promised, and his messengers also had promised. So what does that mean? Is it a sleep state? What type of state is it? We'll inshallah address that next week, and we'll talk about Talqeen Mayyit next week, about the burial and certain elements related to it. Inshallah, we'll stop there today, and we'll continue next week. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.